Sasha Lenko here. I help write and produce the Reconnect America podcast. We recently published Reconnect America host Bill Moyer's conversation with John Strong, a professor of finance at the College of William and Mary. In that conversation, we learned about two major transformations that took place in the U.S. railroad industry as a result of its deregulation in 1980. The first was a reorientation of railroad operations to prioritize the movement of longer, so-called unit trains carrying a single commodity from a single origin to a single destination, and the demarketing or turning away of smaller shipments from smaller customers in smaller places. We learned how deregulation laid the ground for this pivot by allowing tens of thousands of miles of track, serving countless communities, to be spun off or abandoned to allow railroads to focus on serving larger cities and ports. The simultaneous consolidation of the industry from nearly 40 Class 1 railroads into just 7 monopolistic and duopolistic mega railroads by 2000, and a shift from standard public and regulated rates to confidential, individualized, and unregulated contracts, which allowed railroads to give preferential treatment to larger multinational corporations. The second major transformation that Professor Strong discussed was the emergence of the doing less with less operating model known as precision scheduled railroading, or PSR, and the related phenomenon of the financialization of U.S. railroads, or in other words, their effective takeover by an aggressive class of activist investors who view railroads not as businesses to be grown, but as resources to be mined for profit. Our guest in today's episode has been working in the industry since the early days of deregulation, and he witnessed these profound changes firsthand and at close range. He is Ken Kirschling, owner and principal bridge engineer at Railstar Engineering, which just so happens to be Solutionary Rail's next-door office neighbor on Vashon Island, Washington. In this conversation, Ken recounts his experience of the aftermath of deregulation. He does so with a vividness and an immediacy that convey not just the gravity of what he is describing, but also the depth of Ken's commitment to railroading and his passion for seeing railroads live up to their full potential to provide efficient, affordable, and reliable transportation to American communities and the economy. Here is Bill's conversation with Ken Kirschling.
So, Ken, if it's okay, it would be helpful for us if we could start with you talking about how you got involved in rail.
Sure.
And when.
Well, actually, it kind of goes back to when I was 11 years old. I was exposed to railroading through friends of my dad's, and my dad also managed a railroad museum in Green Bay years ago.
What?
And I just had an interest in it. And then in college, I started working summers building railroad track and then became an intern engineer for the Burlington Northern. I believed in railroads. Believe it or not, I took it from an environmental standpoint. That was where I thought railroads were going to be so important in the future. This was before global warming, but just conscious of pollution. And we were more worried about running out of oil at that time. And, railroads are the most efficient way of moving freight and people. So I felt that rail was going to be a thing. It was going to reclaim its rightful place as a very important central role for transportation in the United States. So my professional career followed that. I was a civil and structural engineer working for Burlington Northern, then KKB&A Engineers in Denver. From there, I went to what was then called Osmos, their railroad division. They do railroad bridge work all over the United States. They were called Coppers for a while. They're now called Capital Structures. They're one of the big players in maintaining existing structures and rebuilding them, and they're building some new structures as well. But I did leave them because I fell in love with a young lady that lived in Seattle, left Osmos, came out to Seattle, worked for HNTB Consulting Engineers, where I helped get the Sounder train up and running. I was assistant to the chief engineer for HNTB's efforts in Sounder. And then when that ran its course, I went down to San Francisco and commuted to San Francisco weekly for a year on Caltrain. And Caltrain, I've kept an eye on it, and I'm really excited about where Caltrain is right now, all electric. I left HNTB for my real goal, which was to work for a Class 1 railroad. And I went to work for Canadian National, which was a really great railroad. I kind of miss it, but they moved us to Edmonton, Alberta, where I was a senior structural engineer, and I was in charge of the design of all new structures or rebuilds in the United States, but managing it out of Alberta, out of Edmonton. I begged for a position down in the United States and took a position in the Fox Valley of Wisconsin, which was practically home. In fact, I was able to move back to my hometown of Green Bay, Wisconsin, with CN as a manager of structures, and then took the same position with BNSF in Seattle. Came out here in 2007 and lasted 1 year. I didn't really fit with the BNSF corporate culture, and they let me go. But it was a great time because in 2010 is when the Railway Safety Act kicked in, and all railroads, including short lines, had to start inspecting bridges annually. And that was a perfect market for me to enter. And that's what I've been doing ever since at Railstar. It's my own little practice here on Vashon Island. We have two excellent civil and structural engineers working for me, and we're probably going to hire another one.
That is such a great story. And, it's fun to be in the front row or your neighbor through a portion of that, right? We have offices in the same building. We're right next to each other. And it wasn't until 2013, 2016, through that period when we were working on the book, that I even started paying attention to railroads. And so it's been very useful. And I've learned a lot by having you as a neighbor. And I really appreciate all the mentorship and the generous time you've spent helping me understand things. So just going back to a little bit of your timeline there, approximately what year were you at BN?
Well, I was there at two different times, and neither of them were very long, actually. Now that I look back at it, I was an intern engineer in 81 and 82. I was a management trainee in 83 and 84, and then left and returned to what then became Burlington Northern Santa Fe here in Seattle. That was in 07, and I lasted till the end of 09.
Okay. I'm just curious because we're doing a lot of work trying to understand the progression of the business model and the regulatory system that was interacting with the rail. So 81 to 82 is a very interesting time to come into it, right after Staggers. So before we go into depth on those things, when was HNTB? What period was that?
That was 98 through about 2000. Then I went to work for CN.
Okay. And after 84 to 98, what did I miss there?
First, I worked for KKB&A in Denver, which was a civil and structural consulting firm. And I ended up in their bridge group, oddly enough, doing their rail bridge stuff, which was kind of interesting. Some of it was the Durango Silverton narrow gauge, which was a gas. But that was until 87. And in 87, I went to work for Osmos. And Osmos was really probably one of the best company I've ever worked for, from 87 through just about 97. Yeah, close to 10 years. Became their manager of operations by the time I left. It was hard to leave there. They were a really good company.
Wow. So 97. And is that about when you went to CN? No, that's at HNTB.
Right.
And then did you go to CN after HNTB?
Yes.
So around 2000, you were at CN. Okay.
Yes.
So that's cool. I appreciate you going back over that with me because lately we've been talking to economists and other academics about this period between 1980 and the present. And it seemed to me that it would be really great to get your on the ground personal experience. And what's clear is like not everybody who's involved in railroads is a locomotive engineer or conductor, right? A lot of the workforce that are involved in keeping a railroad going are people like yourself who's taking care of the infrastructure that the trains operate on, et cetera. So from your on the ground perspective, when you came into BN right after Staggers, do you remember anything about that time? Was there anything that specifically stands out? What was railroading like as people were moving into the post-Staggers era?
Well, the overarching concept at BN back then was coal, because the Powder River Basin was just getting going. And the BN was spending millions and millions of dollars upgrading their capacity. In fact, they built an entire new line from Gillette to Orrin, Wyoming, that was a north-south main line that did not exist before. And that was really unusual construction. And it was all for coal, which is interesting now that coal is on the decline. But I was at breakfast with Walter Drexel when I was a management trainee just starting out. And I remember him saying that they want to be the low cost carrier, which should have been a warning sign to me right then, because it was about getting the cost down instead of necessarily keeping the quality up. And it was about coal. They wanted to get the lowest possible cost to haul coal. The question I didn't ask, but I should have, was, well, what happens after coal? But to them, it was all focused on coal at the time. And here we are post coal, and they dropped the ball. They just didn't pay attention to service as much as just the costs. And post Staggers, the class ones were absolutely focused on reducing costs. And of course, that hasn't changed much. But I mean, they were in a new environment where they were negotiating contracts with customers instead of using, ICC prescribed rates. And in some ways, I guess it was a good thing. They were acting more like a business instead of like a utility. But as you know, there were a lot of negatives to that. They did not pay as much attention to existing customers. They weren't competing on service anymore. Before Staggers, that was how they got their business, was by competing on service. After Staggers, it was cost, getting the cost down.
Right. And so they had that period where a lot of the previous branch lines were starting to be spun off or abandoned. Do you remember anything about how that was from the inside?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that was so huge. I'm glad you brought that up. I really became aware of that when I went to Osmos, which was in 87. And short lines were just starting to blossom, if you will. The class ones were spinning off or leasing off so many lines at that time. And at Osmos, we had always made our money from the class ones. There were more class ones back then, by the way. That was before there were so many mergers. I mean, mergers had already happened, but there were a lot more in front of them at the time. But I remember my boss at Osmos, he had no faith that the short lines were going to survive. He had no faith that they would be a market for our services, which was bridge repair. And the area manager that I went to work for in Kansas City, Dennis Dolan, said, "Oh, come on, man. This is where it's at. The short lines are the next thing. They are the ones that are going to be growing." And my boss had a tough time with that. His name was Ken Norton, best boss I ever had. But Dennis was right. And by the time I left Osmos, short lines were practically a third of our work. So short lines were definitely the thing, and they have been since. And they're the only ones that are still paying attention to service, by the way.
Right. Because if they don't provide service, they lose their business to trucks primarily, right?
Exactly right. Yep.
And it was that period where we went from having 8,000 miles of short line to having something like 45,000 miles of short lines. So my understanding is that a lot of those branch lines were also embargoed, meaning they weren't getting the maintenance that they needed. And so as the short lines inherited them, when it deferred maintenance and the difficulties around that and slower trains, what was the arc that you saw?
Well, deferred maintenance led to staggers, So while the class ones were trying to compete with each other to get business and keep it away from trucks with service, because the interstate highway system had been fully subsidized and built by the late 70s, a lot of the business that, especially the time sensitive business that the railroads had been siphoned off by trucks. They were competing for business, but the trucks were pushing rates down, and the railroads couldn't afford to keep running trains fast for the little amount of revenue that they could generate with it. So they were in a tough spot. And a lot of class ones started to have so much track that was down to 10 miles an hour or embargoed that trains were not getting over the railroad. So that was a downward spiral. That was the classic downward spiral that as the condition of the tracks deteriorated, the speed of the trains deteriorated, the volume of traffic that they could move over their railroads deteriorated. That meant less revenue, meant less money for track maintenance, and so on. And there were some railroads that were just grinding to a halt. Rock Island was the classic example. Milwaukee Road wasn't far behind. The Penn Central was a morass of slow track. And it was Staggers it was looked at as the way to save railroads. But I believe I heard it through you, Bill, that what Staggers really did is it saved the owners of railroads, but not necessarily the railroads themselves. So it changed the game. It allowed railroads, instead of having to deal with rates set by the ICC, to negotiate their own rates. They crafted what they were doing a lot differently. They went for volume, and they went for the traffic that other modes really couldn't haul, as we call it, the captive traffic to the railroad, mostly heavy bulk materials. All the traffic that generated the really good profits were time sensitive, and the trucks marched off with that. The trucks couldn't be as competitive on the bulk materials, coal, chemicals, grain. And so that's what the railroads focused on. And it was a business decision. You can hardly fault them for it. And in fact, you have to credit railroad management. Since Staggers, look at how far the class ones have come. They're all profitable now. Back when I got into the railroad business, they were looking pretty weak. I mean, a lot of them were not revenue sufficient. A lot of them were barely making, a dollar and a penny on every dollar that they spent. So it was a big change. But unfortunately, the way that Staggers was written, it made it easier for railroads to get rid of the tracks that they didn't feel they could make money on, thus the spin-offs to the short lines. And yeah, it changed their focus. Now, from my standpoint, back in the 80s, it was an exciting time because this emergence of the short lines back then was a huge ray of hope. And the short line industry in the beginning was much more entrepreneurial than it is now. Instead of having a giant holding company like Genesee in Wyoming or Rail America, you had all these different short line railroads. Each one of them were interested, they were aggressive about getting things going on that piece of track that they were buying or taking control of. And I thought it was fantastic. The one railroad that was in our backyard, because I was living in Madison, Wisconsin, was the Wisconsin Central. And to this day, I think the Wisconsin Central was one of the finest railroads the United States ever had. They were service oriented. They had some of the most motivated workers I've ever run across, some of the proudest railroaders I've ever worked with. It was a fantastic time. I wish it would have kept going, but then following that came like Rail America that started to put a bunch of railroads under one holding company. And unfortunately, when you get bigger like that, then management starts to push things down onto the individual railroads that might not really fit. So the people that were left on the ground at these short lines were starting to get a little disillusioned because they couldn't go after the business like they used to. And I definitely sense that because we worked directly for those people. We worked for the people that owned those railroads or ran them. We talked to them all the time. We high railed with them all over the place. They wore so many hats. They were the head of their bridges one day, the head of their tracks the next day, the head of their locomotives, the day after that. But it was a very exciting time. And the class ones were still pretty robust too. It was before some of the mega mergers, before like BNSF, for example, or before Union Pacific vacuumed up all these other railroads. Anything that had Pacific in it ended up under Union Pacific and Rio Grande and Southern Pacific and Missouri Pacific. I mean, all those railroads are gone now. And each one of those in the 80s were still powerhouses.
Okay, so you're getting to something here that I would love to parse out a little bit more. So you open up talking about the low cost railroad that BN wanted to become. So the investments in coal. So that sort of clues into the emergence of unit trains that are one particular commodity. And then it sounds like before that next wave of consolidation, some of these other railroads, were they still competing or attempting to compete for carload service, or were they also moving towards unit trains?
So railroads in the 80s, even though it was post staggers, were still competing for service. There were a lot of railroads left that paralleled other railroads. And so service still mattered. A good example was the Denver and Rio Grande partnering with the Missouri Pacific on one end and the Western Pacific on the other end to move freight back and forth between California and the West Coast and through the Kansas City and St. Louis gateways. And because the Union Pacific wasn't too far north of them, the Union Pacific also moved a lot of freight the same regions of the country. So these were competitors, and they ran fast trains and they hustled their freight. But the Union Pacific ended up owning all those railroads. And so now what used to be the Missouri Pacific across southern Colorado, southern Kansas, northern Oklahoma, that's freaking short line now. The Union Pacific had no interest in having parallel routes, even though each one of those routes generated a lot of their own traffic. But they looked at this large volume of traffic moving from the eastern United States to the western United States, and they looked at the Rio Grande, Southern Pacific, Western Pacific, and Missouri Pacific as a higher cost route to do the same thing. So what's really unfortunate is they threw the baby out with the bathwater. Even though those lines went through communities that the Union Pacific didn't go through, they still thought in bigger terms than that. They weren't out on the ground railroading with the local superintendents and train masters that were moving the traffic locally and were paying attention to the local customers. They looked at it from a big view at 30,000 feet, looking down on all these systems and said, why do we need two routes across the Midwest? Let's get rid of this higher cost one. We'll just vacuum them up and shut them down. And maybe they weren't thinking exactly like that. Maybe that evolved, but that's what's happened.
Yeah, it sounds like those railroads were at that point actually able to compete not just with other railroads, but with trucks. Maybe they were still attempting to compete with trucks for that carload.
They absolutely were. The Rio Grande is a classic example of a hustler that just tried to move the traffic as quickly as they could. It's really amazing and depressing to me to go out to southeastern Colorado and see what used to be a line that they were running 60-mile-an-hour freight trains on, now a train a week for a short line.
Right. Your affinity for the short lines makes me want to ask, well, they had all this initial excitement, but then at some point, when did they start bumping up against the paper barriers and these other relationships with the class one that they were forced to interchange with? And at what point do they not be able to quote rates anymore? At what point are they unable to offer services because the mainline class one isn't that interested in moving what they've got and won't get them a good rate?
Sure. Well, it was the class ones. So when staggers first happened and allowed the class ones to spin off a lot of these short lines, they were very interested in maintaining the traffic. They just didn't want the expense of switching and the local service that these lines had. But they recognized that, and whether you like unions or not, I don't know how you feel about this, but the fact is they saw that if these lines were run in a more flexible environment where people wore several hats, it would make more business sense. And it certainly did. The people that started running these short lines were very resourceful and hardworking and great people. A lot of the people that worked for the class ones on those short lines decided to go to work for those short lines because they didn't want to leave their home area. Although they all realized that it would mean less money. The class ones were always better at paying. Now, in the beginning, the class ones were enthusiastic about this. They still had the infrastructure to handle the freight from all these secondary lines. They were still interested in making money on this business, and they did. But over the years, a few different things happened. one of them was these class ones became fewer, just like I was talking about how the Union Pacific vacuumed up so many railroads. And as they did that, their focus changed and they no longer had the same interest in working closely with the short lines. And so the short lines weren't getting switched as often, or they weren't getting the cars that they needed. The short lines had to rely on the class ones for the car supply in most cases.
I think what you're getting at is something we're paying attention to is that Staggers opens up all these possibilities, the ability to spin off these branch lines and be freed of obligations they had to labor, the abandonments, the consolidations, and the contracts. By implementing those things, and this is what I'd like you to continue speaking to, it seems to have changed the nature of railroading itself. So maybe you could start to say, well, how did the things that they took advantage of through Staggers shift the nature of railroading post Staggers, leading up to unit trains without getting into PSR?
Yeah, I think I told you, Bill, that when I worked for Burlington Northern, the very first job I had was in Montana in the summer of 81. And we were staking out at that time what we called 52-car grain train tracks. The BN was looking at trying to reduce the cost of hauling grain by narrowing down the number of places where they would pick it up, and mostly pick it up in the plains. They would usually take it all to giant storage places or transloading on the Great Lakes, for example, or in St. Louis, Kansas City, that sort of thing, barges. But in the beginning, they started to say, well, how could we make it more attractive for our wheat growers to move longer trains? And the 52-car grain train was the first thing they came up with. And so what that did is it made some of the grain elevators decide, well, okay, we'll spend the money to get this extra long track here, and we'll hold on to that business that way. But that means that some of our wheat growers are going to have to haul by truck further to get their wheat to a transloading spot. The 52-car grain train was the beginning of that. Now, class ones were always interested in unit trains because unit trains are more efficient. But there was always a discussion going on amongst us railroaders like, yeah, they're more efficient, but the cost per ton of what we haul is much, much less. And so back then, a lot of people were saying, hey, let's not forget about the higher margin business. You know, let's move the vegetables, let's move the paper, let's move the things that people want to get from A to B in a couple of days instead of a couple of weeks. And that's one thing that kind of depresses me because I think they took the easy way out. It was harder to run railroads at higher speeds, better service. You needed more power, you needed more crews. It was easier to move the stuff that didn't complain, and you could take a month to move from A to B instead of a few days. And that went hand in hand with the mergers of the class ones into these mega railroads. That all working together just meant less attention to most of the customers and remaining attention to just the few that moved a great deal of freight. Railroads lost their presence in a lot of places. They pulled people out of offices that used to be division offices in medium-sized cities, and these places became ghost towns. Yeah, the railroad still went through there, but nobody paid attention to the local paper mill or to the local strawberry grower or whatever it might be. And if there's nobody there to work closely with the customers, well, you know, the trucks are always there. Those people, they can shake their hand. They're people that they know that if they give them a load, it's going to get where it's supposed to go. That trucker will break all the rules in the books to get that load there for him. With the railroad, it was much less personal than it used to be. It used to be a very family thing in a sense that there were enough people that worked around the railroads that they had a local presence, they had a face, that they were part of the community. They even would back baseball teams and stuff. But all that went away as the big railroads looked at decreasing costs, you know, the low cost carrier. I heard it in 1983, Walter Drexel. Those were words that have stuck with me ever since.
So how did BN's hiring of executives from ARCO And those executives' promotion of management from the newly acquired Frisco illustrate the reorientation of business that Staggers incentivize.
That's a complicated question. I get the impression that the Frisco merger, and believe me, it was very much talked about because I came there right after the merger. A lot of folks on BN complained that this little Frisco railroad ended up running the BN, which may have been a little bit of an exaggeration, but they certainly were aggressive people and they were given sort of the run of the railroad. They were allowed to take positions of great importance and significance in several different areas, especially maintenance away and operations.
In what way?
They were bastards. They were hard hitters. They were good railroaders. The Frisco was a rough and ready little railroad, a scrapper, if you will. And I have to give them a lot of credit because they were very resourceful. They worked hard to keep their costs down. But at that time, all railroads were still more service oriented, including the Frisco. And there's a lot of guys with the Frisco that I knew personally that they were still very proud of being able to move freight fast and a lot of it. You know, all railroaders were back then. It wasn't the guys out on the railroad that let it go to hell. It was the people at higher levels, of course, as they just cut jobs and well, you know, I won't go off on that tangent right now, but asking about the Frisco, it was like so many mergers, Bill. In every merger, usually one or the other railroad dominates in some way, shape, or form, or is allowed to dominate. A good example would be when the Union Pacific took in the Southern Pacific. The Southern Pacific was just as big as the Union Pacific. It had a lot of good railroad people. But the Union Pacific is known as being the dominant railroad whenever there's a merger. It will be Union Pacific people who run whatever results out of this merger. A railroad twice the size is now run by Union Pacific people. Fascinating.
Okay, so you identified some of the trends of the spin off the short lines, the tendency towards unit trains, and then you described the consolidation and how the consolidation changed railroading. So could you transition from that to when did they stop being able to reap the benefits of staggers and they had to find something else to squeeze more profit out of it? And how do we get from that to PSR in your experience? And were the seeds of that PSR sprinkled throughout? Like, was Hunter Harrison part of that early? And what's the journey of this Hunter Harrison dude?
Well, before Hunter, it was always true that the stock owners had a great amount of influence on how the railroad would be operated. Now, from pre-staggers to early staggers, railroads were still not that lucrative. They were looked at as cash cows. Other businesses or financial interests were interested in acquiring railroads not for profits, but because it was a huge flow of cash that they could tap to do other things with. The Chicago Northwestern divested in other types of businesses, for instance, back when it still was around. They used that cash flow to get into other things that had nothing to do with railroads. Illinois Central was another example of that. They used the cash flow to buy other industries. They were weird things. They had nothing to do with railroading. They were like luggage manufacturing, you know, or whatever.
So is this pre-staggers where the railroads, like I remember reading Men Who Love Trains and hearing about the diverse amount of investments the railroad companies themselves had that had nothing to do with railroading, that they were using those investments to underwrite some of the railroad operations. Is that different from what you're talking about, or is that?
No, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Some famous stuff. If you look into the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central and the tragic merger of the Penn Central, there was investment in a executive jet was a famous one. And it had nothing to do with railroads. In fact, the way they were running it was horrible. And there were these lewd stories of crazy shit that executive jet people would do with women and so on, and executive air had nothing to do with railroading at all. But they were able to tap all that cash that bankrupt railroad still had flowing in order to pick up this executive jet, for example. But once staggers happened, it did change things a lot because it got investors to think, well, maybe we can make money with railroads. And so instead of just thinking about them as a cash cow, for once, all of a sudden, the financial community looked at, well, maybe if we put some money into these, they can be solvent and make money. And so there was a really fascinating time right post staggers where all of a sudden the railroads were putting money into their track, and they had learned a hard lesson from pre-staggers in the downward spiral problem, where if your trains are running so slow that you can't make money, you're going to go out of business. So they put millions and millions of dollars into new ties, new rail, ballast, increasing the speeds on their lines, making them much more reliable, replacing jointed rail with welded rail. I mean, it was a fantastic time to watch the best of railroad technology being put to work with money behind it. And it delivered. We still have some of the benefits of that today because they do move a hell of a lot of freight, and they do it at a low cost. And now, post staggers, they can negotiate their own rates, and they've actually gone so far that they're kind of obnoxious. They're charging so much for captive freight that they're making a killing on it. Warren Buffett knew exactly what he was doing when he bought the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. And that has been a tremendous, not a cash cow, a profit maker for Berkshire Hathaway. And the other class ones are doing quite well. But you were asking about this trend. So one thing that always existed, and it exists in American business anyway, and that is the attention from a few influential major stockholders.
Right. And I want you to go there. But I also think one of the things I just want to refine here is that some of the stuff folks we've been talking about, they're talking about how the index funds like Vanguard didn't exist pre-staggers. Like it's a similar time. Like there's a kind of financialization, deregulation of the finance that creates these institutions, and they are investing and bringing capital to the table, I guess, in the railroads in a way that has the positive benefits that you're talking about, where there's an expanded investment in capacity, et cetera. But that's a different kind of investment. They're not controlling the management style of the railroad. That was a previous time they did that. The major stockholders would be having input on the management of the railroad. But then it sounded like there's a period where entities like BlackRock or Vanguard or these big institutional investors came in, they pumped money, but they were not managing. And then there's this other moment that starts to happen. And I think that's what you're starting to go into.
Yes, right. There always was this influence of Wall Street on how the railroads were run, but it became much, much more intense, really, with precision scheduled railroading. That was the big thing because, yeah, Wall Street would experiment a little bit. They would get some people on the board of directors of some of these railroads, and they would tweak things here and there. But man, when precision scheduled railroading hit, or I should say it started with Hunter. So I was working for CN, by the way. I went to work for CN not too long after Hunter started running it. And Hunter was just a flamboyant character. He knew enough about railroading to really wow financial people. And he knew enough about railroading to piss off all the railroad people that were working for him. I saw him come through Stevens Point, Wisconsin, and tell them how to run their railroad and basically tell them that the heads will roll if they don't change. They would do that for a couple of days. All of Stevens Point would grind to a halt, and they go back to running it the way that they knew how to run it from experience. But Hunter had made his mark. And when Hunter was gone, there was fewer people. There was always a reduction in people, a reduction in infrastructure that always followed Hunter. And that was how Hunter got the attention of the private equity companies or the big investors, the institutional investors, the BlackRocks and so on. They saw that he did this. He was a son of a bitch. He was a marginal railroader, but he was a very forceful person. And he impressed the hell out of financial people. He could talk a hell of a line, loved horses. He had his own horse ranch. He will go down in history as one of these financial icons that made a lot of people a lot of money, but really, after all the dust settled, really just destroyed things in his wake. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, Hunter's legacy to some people is heroism, but anybody that knows anything about really how railroads run just freaking curse when they hear his name. On the CN, he had an easy way to reduce costs because, like I said, it was a crown corporation. They had a lot of infrastructure. They had more than what they needed to run their railroad well. And he saw that. He came from the Illinois Central, which was a scrappy outfit that tore up one of their main lines to stay in business, more or less. So when he got to Canada, hell, it was a freaking feast. Of course, he made that look incredible. It was easy to reduce costs when you had more railroad infrastructure than you needed. The problem was that these investors saw what he did with CN, and they figured he could do that elsewhere. The Canadian Pacific was the next victim, and he went from CN to CP, but CP already was a privately owned railroad. It was not Crown Corporation. So he had to cut deeper and harsher to get the same results. But he did. He got his results there too. And then I followed what happened with Hunter after that. As his health was failing, he went to work for CSX. And before he went to work for CSX, he still was fairly healthy. He still would get over the railroad. He still would learn something about the railroad. He still would make his big show in the various terminals and so on. You're going to go and you're going to go. You're out of here. Tear up those 5 tracks. But when he got to CSX, his health was so bad that he did all his work from his frickin' ranch. And he walked around his ranch with his phone and gave instructions to people looking at a goddamn map of CSX. This is the terminal you're going to reduce operations at. This terminal you're going to shut down. How can a guy do that from his frickin' horse ranch? But that's what he did. And I'm sure CSX people have lots of stories to tell about this. I don't have firsthand experience. I only read about where he went and what happened. But how else can you draw a different conclusion from that? I mean, when you saw how he went through like a frickin' black tornado when I worked for CN, you know, one of the things he did at CN, we had a record year, record profits, record. We all got a big bonus. So then he set his sights on even more profit the following year. That was our goal. All right, well, let's work towards that. Well, we got close. We didn't hit the number. So guess what? Nobody got a bonus. And one of the things at CN was that as a professional like me, on an exempt, you got about 60 to 70% of your income from your salary. You got that other 30% usually from bonus, which varied. I mean, on good years, it would be bigger. On years where things were rough, you'd still get a bonus, but it wouldn't be as big. We made damn near the same amount of profit the next year, and we got nothing. And his answer to that was, well, I didn't get a bonus. We've lost our edge. That's what he said. We've lost our edge. Turns out, oh yeah, he did get a bonus. That came out later. And just to say we lost our edge was a slap in the face. Everybody was trying to make Hunter's railroad work. Hunter was an asshole. I said to people, young people who were disciples of Hunter, they'd been to Hunter camp and they were all gaga about how great Hunter was. But I said, that guy needs to get out of this business. He's ruining it. And young people couldn't understand that. They were so entranced by his Hunter talks and so on. He was a hell of a motivator. He was a great motivational speaker. That's the kind of person he was. He was a marginal railroader. He made a lot of money, but at great cost.
Wow.
And I'll quote that to anybody, confident to say that. And I'm sure a lot of other railroad people that were close to the ground will agree with that.
Wow.
Precision scheduled railroading. Railroads were trying to run precision scheduled. Railroads had always been trying to optimize their operations, their locomotive distribution, their power distribution, their car distribution. That was always something they worked so hard to optimize. How can some person come along and say, now we're going to be precision scheduled? What does that mean? It doesn't mean shit. Yeah, in some cases it meant, oh, well, if you have a train leaving town and you got 50 hoppers of coal and there's 3 tank cars sitting there, you might as well pick them up too and put them on there because they're moving the same direction. Duh. Yeah, Good railroaders would do that anyway. But for some reason, that was one of the great hunter things. That was somehow part of precision scheduled railroading. It was a fairy tale. It was a euphemism for reducing labor and reducing the capital that was necessary to run the railroad.
Wow.
I saw offices closed. I saw tracks pulled up. I saw switches spiked.
And that must be just for a guy who's dedicated his entire life. It's from your time you were 11 years old, loved and experienced railroading.
It's crushing. It's so fucking crushing because here I was thinking, especially staggers, I was going to see a renewed, rejuvenated rail industry. And for a while, it looked like that was happening. Railroads were investing in their physical plant. The short lines in the beginning were very promising, but then the short lines were getting bought out by holding companies that would run many short lines, like Genesee and Wyoming now. The class ones continue to consolidate and pay no attention to the complaints from their customers about poor service. And, here the amount of freight moving in the United States is increasing about equal with our increase in GDP, and railroads were not. What's up with that? Yeah, it is tough, man. It's a thing that I feel like I'm a failure because I latched on to an industry that instead of really taking off became sort of a joke. I'm still proud that we still move a lot of freight and we do it without burning up a lot of fuel. And I think that's worth hanging on to.
Yeah. And what is true today isn't necessarily true tomorrow. And so if you were going to make key decisions for railroading and these investments, what would you do now?
Well, unfortunately, the way that railroads are owned by stockholders, and in many cases now more and more private equity, I don't know if I'd have the freedom to do anything differently. I mean, they're running it to keep their investors as happy as possible. I think that we need a change of how railroads are regulated. And boy, the railroads do not want to hear that. Or to make them publicly owned, like they are in Europe. In Europe, the tracks, the infrastructure is mostly now owned publicly, but the freights and the passenger trains are operated by private operators now. A model like that, I think, would suit our country better. Or if the way that the regulations were formulated, that railroads, first of all, they'd have to be truly common carriers like they used to. They would have to take business. During the ICC, railroads couldn't refuse freight. If somebody wanted to move something by rail, they had to do it, unless it was really some extreme problem. And they had a rate that they had to go by. Now, that was a problem. But perhaps going back to truly a common carrier status where railroads do have to move freight that's brought to them, but they have to do it at a reasonable rate. As you know, Bill, one of our good friends who operates railroads in the southeast part of Washington has a big problem trying to move things because the Union Pacific prices them out of the market whenever they want to try to get business going, for instance, between southeast Washington and Portland. What can he do? The UP's got him. That didn't exist before staggers.
Right. So one of the things that's in Congress now is called the Reliable Rail Service Act, and it would set standards for service. And I would need to check, but now there's exempted commodities, which is pretty much everything except for coal, wheat, and crude oil and some hazardous materials. And then there's non-exempted commodities that I just mentioned. Even the people who move the supposedly still non-exempted commodities that have common carrier rates, they don't want to. They feel like they pay a price if they use the published tariff rate. And there's very little service difference whether they use the tariff rate or whether they use a contract rate. So my understanding is that the Reliable Rail Service Act would set a minimum standard for service so that then others could get access to the tracks so that they could provide a better service and a better rate. So, maybe there's things like that.
If railroads were forced to allow open access, which they loathe that idea, but hey, look what it can do. Europe moves more trains over a piece of railroad than railroads in the United States. Railroads move a few super long, heavy, bloated trains Whereas in Europe, they know how to dispatch trains. They can move hundreds and hundreds of trains for every one train that gets moved in this country. And they have to, from what I understand, and I'm not an expert on Europe by any stretch, but from what I understand, they pretty much have to accommodate any reasonable operator that meets the standards for operational characteristics. So if they want to open up a service moving trailers on flat cars between Paris and Amsterdam or something like that, they really have to take a look at that. They have to take it seriously.
Right. And, we interviewed a guy named Carlo Borghini years ago when he was part of the Shift to Rail project at the EU. And that was really interesting. And they were still struggling to compete with trucks because they've even got shorter distances. And so it's a significant challenge in Europe for sure. One of the things that's great about being your neighbor in the Sheffield building is getting to see the young engineers that you're bringing in and you're mentoring and giving an opportunity to come into this world. And it seems like that's also part of what's necessary, isn't it? Because people have to learn how to run railroads and they have to learn how to maintain. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity for jobs if we had a really robust railroad. If we had a goal of taking that trillion ton miles of long haul freight that's currently right on trucks and transitioning it to railroads, we'd need a lot of folks like the guys and gals that work for you.
Oh, it'd be so exciting. We'd need people that are interested in operations. People are interested in the infrastructure part of it, like I am, the mechanical engineering part of it, of locomotives, battery locomotives, mixed hybrid type locomotives are happening. I mean, it's still exciting, and it could be very exciting, very attractive for a lot of young people. The young people I talk to, and I talk to a lot of them, overall, they don't know much about railroads, but they like them and they wish they could ride them and they think it's a good idea. So they know enough about the efficiency of railroads that they're positive about them for the most part. But they don't know why they don't compete better than they do when I explain to them the situation. But, the two engineers that are working for me, and now I've got a business manager who's come on full time, probably going to bring another engineer. Once they learn a little bit about railroads, they start to get enthused about it. They see that it's kind of cool, It's cool that you're in a niche in a way, but I think you've already figured this out, Bill. There's a mystique about railroading that gets in your blood, and it's something that makes you really proud. It's a cool thing.
It's really easy to catch the bug because there's just so many cool things. I mean, yeah, the opportunity for electrification, the opportunity for mode shift, the opportunity for transmission on rail corridors, the opportunity for revitalizing local rural places and small industry by allowing them to move their stuff by train, or the counties to free them from the obligation of maintaining those roads that the trucks are tearing up. And people don't love being trapped on a freeway that's dominated by all these trucks. It's just such a no-brainer. And it's interesting because you use the word efficiency, I use the word efficiency, and we're using it in a completely different way than the efficiency that the PSR people are talking about. We're talking about the efficiency of energy, of those externalized costs that they're pushing out onto society. And we're saying, no, we don't have to have those externalized costs. If you use the right infrastructure, if you rationalize or harmonize the infrastructure that you have, so you're using roads when you need to use roads, and you're using tracks whenever that you can possibly use tracks. There's an efficiency, or what somebody said in a different conversation was, is there a difference between efficiency and optimization? So like maybe what we're talking about is an optimized infrastructure, an infrastructure that's optimized to deliver on the public purpose, not just merely the private corporate purpose of increasing shareholder value. And if we really could focus on the optimization, and if society could prioritize the optimization of these railroads, their corridors, and that mode of transportation, we could start to deliver a lot of savings in a variety of ways and a lot of benefits, and we could reduce harms.
Absolutely. And when railroads were first being built in this country, in many cases, property owners were so enthusiastic about them coming that they'd allow easements over their property, knowing that that would allow them more flexibility in their transportation. I mean, there were a lot of people probably that were just like today, they wouldn't want somebody on their property. But for the most part, people were very enthusiastic. And at that time, railroads were looked at kind of like highways are now. They were the way to become more successful because they could move their freight, get it to market, and so on. That could still exist. I mean, these railroads had a compact with the states and the counties that they built their tracks through that they would serve them. And now they are like, we don't give a shit about what you people think. We're a business. We're going to do this our way. And if we derail a chemical train in your backyard, too bad, instead of being positive members of the community.
Yeah, and they're critical national infrastructure. And this does kind of bring us back to this whole US experiment of entrusting private for-profit corporations to deliver a public purpose, which is a robust and fluid and high velocity transportation system for moving people and stuff. And this process of doing this podcast has been just learning that each step of the way, they'd have a way to make enough profit to attract the capital and keep them in. And then it wouldn't quite work enough, and they'd have to find another way. And then there'd be one rescue, or there'd be a takeover by the public, or then there'd be one thing after another, like taking away their need to move people, setting up Conrail, doing staggers. And then after staggers, they're finding these initial like low-hanging fruit for creating profitability again. And then when they've used that up, they lean into the unit train thing. And then when they've used that up, they lean into the PSR thing. And now they've used that up. And now they're leaning into one last stage of consolidations with this completely eliminating the possibility for actual competition.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, let's consolidate, but let's consolidate into a national steel interstate and make it an open access system where anybody who's a qualified railroader can book time on the system and deliver service. And people compete, and we maximize utilization, not use market control to squeeze the last bit, always the last little bit of juice out of the stone in order to make someone else richer while everybody else pays the cost of not having a robust rail system.
Yeah.
So it does feel like we're in a really important pivotal moment. And one of the words that I really want to start applying to the railroads is something I'm hearing about the tech industry, where something like Facebook, it's awesome at first. It can do all this stuff. You can reach all your friends. It gets everybody on board. There's no ads. And then the algorithms kick in, and you make a post and you don't know who's going to see it. And then your feed is all this other bullshit trying to sell you stuff. And what this one guy calls it is the enshittification of the internet. Well, we're experiencing, because of this greedy system we're part of, the enshittification of the railroads, it seems to me. It seems like they're milking as much as they can out of it. It's getting to be shittier and shittier. And it's not okay, because we don't need a shitty infrastructure. We need an infrastructure that maximizes benefit and reduces harm.
Amen. And, we've already watched so many valuable corridors be eliminated, abandoned, completely gone now. Between Green Bay and Chicago, Amtrak still says that's one of the routes that they might want to reactivate in the future. There's a problem. A couple of the lines that used to go between Green Bay and Chicago aren't there anymore. And the fastest one that went along the lakeshore from Green Bay to Manitowoc, Sheboygan, half of that's pulled up by the Union Pacific. We've lost so much of our network already. And there's enough of it there that I think we could still reactivate some of these lines, rejuvenate them. But yes, I totally agree. More of a national rail network, or just a network that's regulated to these better ends. I mean, isn't that what's happening with American business right now? It's being so unregulated that it's just becoming ultra destructive. People are starting to see it. Private equity is just a leech that is a way of sucking value out of companies that actually were profitable or employed a lot of people and made enough profit to keep the owners happy. Once they're sucked up by private equity, it's all about pulling out as much cash as they possibly can and then actually profiting on the bankruptcy of the carcass. The railroads are horribly close to that right now. And with this laissez-faire attitude on all business in the United States, they're just going to let it happen. And nobody's going to really care unless there's people like you and me that make a noise. Fortunately, we're not the only couple. I mean, there are a lot of people that are pro-rail, as you know.
Yeah, there are a lot of people, and we really need to be locking arms with each other to move this forward, because there's just no reason that we shouldn't be able to do this, because this really should transcend any kind of party affiliation. It really is about taking care of our communities and the place that sustains us and our country. It just seems like the most patriotic thing to do would be to revitalize these railroads. So anyway, I know you've got a really busy schedule and we've already taken a lot of your time, so I'm gonna let you get back to work. But Ken Kirschling, Railstar Engineering, thank you so much for your leadership, for your mentorship, and for hanging out with us on Reconnect America.
Bill, thank you so much for what you do. As I've said many times, I am so excited about what you're doing. I wish I could help more. We're all so goddamn busy, but yeah, thanks, Bill, and your team. Awesome effort. Thank you.
That was Ken Kirschling of Railstar Engineering in conversation with Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer. This conversation was edited for clarity and brevity by me, Sasha Elenko. Thank you to Oda Proda for the theme music. You can find the show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.